The morning of June 10, 1989, dawned crisp and clear over Willowbrook Springs, Tennessee, with the kind of perfect weather that seemed heaven-sent for a wedding day. The First Presbyterian Church of Willowbrook Springs stood majestically at the heart of the small town, its white steeple reaching toward azure skies dotted with wispy clouds that looked like angels' wings dancing in the gentle breeze that carried the sweet scent of honeysuckle and climbing roses from the church's memorial garden. Inside the church's groom's preparation room, 26-year-old Michael Christopher Hawthorne adjusted his navy blue silk tie for the 20th time in the past hour, his hands trembling slightly as he stood before the full-length antique mirror that had reflected countless nervous grooms over the decades. His best man, Thomas Alexander Quinton, watched with a mixture of amusement and genuine concern as Michael ran his fingers through his dark brown hair, which his bride-to-be had always said reminded her of rich Colombian coffee beans when the morning sunlight caught the natural highlights. "Mike, you need to breathe, brother," Thomas said, placing a steady, reassuring hand on his friend's shoulder and noticing how tense Michael's muscles felt beneath the expensive fabric of his formal jacket. "Rebecca Elizabeth is going to be absolutely radiant walking down that aisle. This is the day you've both been dreaming about since high school, planning for months, praying about for years." Michael smiled nervously, his emerald green eyes reflecting both joy and the natural anxiety that came with such an important milestone. He was thinking of Rebecca Elizabeth Sinclair, the woman who had captured his heart 7 years ago when they were both juniors at Willowbrook Springs High School, sitting in Mrs. Patterson's advanced literature class, debating the deeper meanings of Emily Dickinson's poetry. She had been the valedictorian, the church organist whose fingers could make the old Hammond organ sing like angels, the girl who volunteered at the local animal shelter every Saturday morning without fail, rain or shine, helping care for abandoned puppies and stray cats with the same gentle compassion she showed every living creature. Her long auburn hair caught sunlight like spun copper wire, cascading in natural waves past her shoulders, and her emerald green eyes seemed to hold depths of kindness and intelligence that made everyone around her feel loved, understood, and valued. Rebecca had a way of listening, really listening, when people spoke to her, as if their words were the most important things she had ever heard. Children gravitated toward her natural warmth, elderly folks shared their deepest stories with her, and even the most cynical teenagers found themselves opening up about their dreams and fears when Rebecca asked with genuine interest about their lives. "I just want everything to be perfect for her, Tom," Michael said, straightening his shoulders and adjusting the white rose boutonniere that Rebecca had personally selected from Mrs. Ashford's flower shop, insisting on the particular variety that had been her grandmother's favorite. "Rebecca deserves the most beautiful wedding day imaginable. She's been planning every single detail for months, the flowers arranged just so, the music carefully selected to tell our love story, even the little favor bags for the guests that she hand-sewed herself during those long winter evenings when we'd sit by the fireplace and plan our future together. She hand-wrote every invitation in that gorgeous calligraphy of hers, staying up late to make sure each guest felt personally welcome to our celebration." The church sanctuary was filling with guests, and the air buzzed with excited anticipation mixed with the soft murmur of old friends catching up and families sharing stories about the young couple everyone had watched fall in love. The morning light streamed through the magnificent stained glass windows, gifts from founding families whose descendants still worshipped in these same pews, casting rainbow patterns across the polished wooden floors and highlighting the elaborate floral arrangements that Rebecca had dreamed about since she was a little girl playing wedding dress-up in her grandmother's attic. Reverend Samuel Harrison Matthews, who had baptized both Michael and Rebecca in the very baptismal font where their own children would someday be dedicated to God, was reviewing his notes one final time in his study. At 62 years old, with silver hair that caught the light like spun moonbeams and kind eyes that had seen decades of joy and sorrow in his congregation, Reverend Matthews had officiated hundreds of weddings. But this one held special significance that went beyond the normal pastoral care he provided. He had counseled the young couple through their engagement, watching their faith deepen and their commitment to each other strengthen with each passing month of preparation. This union, he had told his wife Margaret just that morning over breakfast, buttering his toast while she poured fresh coffee from their wedding china that they only used for special occasions, is exactly what Christian marriage should be. Two souls united not just in romantic love, but in purpose and faith and the desire to serve God together. Michael and Rebecca understand that marriage is a sacred covenant, not just a legal contract or a romantic ideal. They've prayed together, studied scripture together, talked honestly about their dreams and fears and expectations. They're ready for this blessing. Meanwhile, across town at the Sinclair family home on Magnolia Avenue, what should have been a scene of joyful preparation was instead marked by growing anxiety that seemed to thicken the morning air like humidity before a summer storm. Mrs. Eleanor Catherine Sinclair paced the hardwood floors of the Victorian home, her silk mother-of-the-bride dress, a soft rose color that Rebecca had chosen to complement her own ivory gown, rustling with each worried step across floors that creaked in familiar patterns she had walked for over 30 years. The house, built in 1923 by Eleanor's grandfather and lovingly maintained by 3 generations of Sinclairs, should have been filled with laughter and last-minute wedding preparations. The dining room table should have been covered with lipstick tubes and bobby pins, with Rebecca's bridesmaids chattering excitedly while they helped each other with final touches. The kitchen should have been bustling with the controlled chaos of getting ready for the reception, with covered dishes and last-minute additions to the menu that always seemed to materialize at Sinclair family celebrations. Instead, an eerie quiet had settled over the house like a blanket of unease that no one could quite understand or explain. Where could she be? Eleanor whispered to her husband, Dr. William Benjamin Sinclair, who stood by the bay window in the front parlor, his medical training automatically cataloging possibilities while his father's heart tried to reject the darker scenarios his professional mind suggested. Rebecca was so excited last night when she went to bed. She laid out her wedding dress with such care, arranged all her jewelry on the vanity table like she was setting up a shrine, even set out her shoes and stockings and the new lingerie we bought in Nashville last month. She said she wanted to wake up early and spend time in prayer and reflection before getting ready, that she wanted to start her wedding day with gratitude to God for bringing her and Michael together. Dr. Sinclair, a respected physician in Willowbrook Springs for over 30 years who had delivered half the babies in town and comforted countless families through medical crises, felt his medical training kick in as he tried to think logically about his daughter's absence while fighting against the parental panic that threatened to overwhelm his professional composure. Rebecca's bed had been slept in, the covers were rumpled in the way that indicated restless sleep rather than careful bed-making, and her cotton nightgown was folded neatly at the foot of the bed in her characteristic precise manner. But when Eleanor had gone to wake her at 7 o'clock for the traditional mother-daughter breakfast they had planned, fresh strawberries and cream, homemade biscuits with honey butter, and the special blend of coffee that Rebecca's great-grandmother had served at her own wedding breakfast in 1898, Rebecca was nowhere to be found. Her car is still in the driveway, Dr. Sinclair observed, his voice tight with worry as he watched through lace curtains that had hung in this window since his mother-in-law's time. And her purse is on her dresser, along with her car keys and the small cross necklace she wears every day. If she went somewhere, she walked, which means she couldn't have gone far. Rebecca isn't the type to wander off without telling anyone, especially not today of all days. Eleanor's sister, Victoria Rose Chamberlain, who had driven down from Nashville the evening before to serve as matron of honor, tried to maintain an optimistic tone despite her own growing concern that seemed to mirror the dark clouds gathering on the horizon despite the weather forecast that had promised clear skies. Victoria, 2 years younger than Eleanor and a successful attorney who had learned to project confidence even when she felt uncertain, found herself struggling to find reasonable explanations for her niece's absence. Maybe she went for an early morning walk to calm her nerves. Victoria suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. You know how Rebecca loves to walk through Patterson Memorial Park when she needs to think and pray. She's been doing that since she was a little girl, especially when she has important decisions to make or when she's feeling overwhelmed. And today is certainly overwhelming in the best possible way. But as the clock ticked toward 9:30, just 30 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, when the organist would start playing the prelude music that Rebecca had so carefully selected, even Victoria's forced optimism began to crack like paint in the summer heat. Rebecca's wedding dress, a vision of ivory silk and hand-sewn pearls that had taken 3 months to alter to perfection, hung untouched in the armoire like a ghost of dreams that might never be fulfilled. Her great-grandmother's pearl earrings, which were to be her something old and carried the blessing of 4 generations of Sinclair brides, remained in their velvet jewelry box. The something new, a delicate gold bracelet engraved with Proverbs 31 verse 25 that Michael had given her as a wedding gift just last week, lay wrapped in tissue paper on her vanity table, waiting for fingers that should have been trembling with excitement to fasten it around her wrist. At First Presbyterian Church, guests began to murmur quietly among themselves as 10 a.m. came and went with no sign of the bridal party, no rustle of satin and silk, no excited whispers of, "Here she comes," that should have preceded Rebecca's triumphant walk down the aisle toward the man who loved her more than life itself. Michael's mother, Patricia Ann Hawthorne, nervously adjusted the orchid corsage on her wrist as she glanced repeatedly toward the church entrance, her maternal instincts sensing that something was terribly wrong even though her rational mind insisted there must be a simple explanation. The sanctuary was decorated exactly as Rebecca had envisioned during those long winter evenings when she and Michael had pored over bridal magazines and sketched out seating charts and debated the merits of white roses versus ivory ones. White roses and baby's breath adorned every available surface, their sweet fragrance mingling with the smell of lemon oil used to polish the wooden pews and the faint traces of Mrs. Henderson's famous pound cake that had been prepared for the reception. Ivory ribbon marked each pew in perfect bows that Rebecca's college roommate had tied the night before, and candles flickered softly in the morning light streaming through stained glass windows that told the story of Christ's life in brilliant blues and golds and crimsons. "Should I go check on the Sinclair house?" asked Mrs. Dorothy Jean Phillips, Rebecca's former Sunday school teacher and one of the church's most devoted members, a woman who had known Rebecca since she was 6 years old and singing in the children's choir with a voice like a tiny angel. "It's not like Rebecca to be late for anything, especially not her own wedding. That girl has been punctual since she learned to tell time, always 5 minutes early for everything from piano lessons to volunteer work." Reverend Matthews stepped forward, his weathered face creased with concern that went beyond normal wedding day jitters. In his 4 decades of ministry, he had seen nervous brides and anxious grooms, forgotten rings and torn dresses, family arguments and last-minute cold feet. But he had never seen a bride simply vanish on her wedding day, especially not a bride as responsible and devoted as Rebecca Sinclair. "Let me call Dr. Sinclair directly," he said, moving toward the church office with the measured pace of a man who had learned not to panic in crisis situations but who felt his pastoral heart beginning to race with possibilities he didn't want to consider. There must be a reasonable explanation. Perhaps Rebecca became ill during the night, or there was some family emergency that required immediate attention. The phone call that followed sent shockwaves through both families like lightning splitting a summer sky. Dr. Sinclair's voice was strained and tight with worry as he explained that Rebecca was missing, that she had apparently left the house sometime before dawn without taking her car, her purse, or any indication of where she might be going or when she might return. "We need to organize a search immediately," Dr. Sinclair said, his physician's composure beginning to crack as the father's panic threatened to overwhelm the professional calm he had maintained through decades of medical crises. "This isn't like Rebecca. Something is terribly wrong. My daughter would never do this voluntarily, would never cause this kind of worry on the day that was supposed to be the happiest of her life." Michael felt his knees weaken as the weight of the news hit him like a physical blow, and Thomas quickly steadied him before he could collapse onto the Persian rug that had been donated to the church by the founding families. "She wouldn't just leave," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying all the conviction of a man who knew the woman he loved better than he knew himself. "Rebecca would never do this. She was so excited about today, about starting our marriage, about the future we planned together down to the smallest detail. Something has happened to her. Someone has taken her or hurt her, and we need to find her now." Within an hour that seemed to stretch like eternity, the wedding guests had transformed into search parties with the efficiency of a military operation. The men changed out of their suits and ties, trading formal wear for practical clothes suitable for combing through woods and fields and anywhere else a young woman might have gone or been taken. The women organized food and communication efforts at the church, turning the fellowship hall into a command center that buzzed with quiet efficiency and desperate hope. Reverend Matthews led a prayer for Rebecca's safety before the groups dispersed across Willowbrook Springs, his voice strong and confident despite the fear that clutched at his heart like icy fingers. "Heavenly Father, we come before you in this moment of crisis and confusion, trusting in your infinite wisdom and your boundless love for Rebecca. We pray for her safety, wherever she may be. We pray for guidance in our search efforts. And we pray for peace in the hearts of all who love her, even as we refuse to give up hope that she will be restored to us quickly and safely. The Willowbrook Springs Police Department, led by Sheriff James Robert Hutchinson, immediately launched an official investigation with the seriousness and urgency typically reserved for the most serious crimes. Sheriff Hutchinson, a methodical man who had served the community for 15 years and had never seen a case quite like this one, treated Rebecca's disappearance with the utmost gravity despite the short time frame and the lack of obvious signs of foul play. In my experience, he told the assembled families in the church fellowship hall that had been transformed into an emergency command center, when someone as reliable and predictable as Rebecca Sinclair goes missing on the most important day of her life, we're dealing with either a serious accident or deliberate foul play. We'll search every inch of this town and the surrounding countryside until we find answers, and will follow every lead no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. The search continued throughout the day and into the evening, with volunteers who had come to celebrate a wedding instead finding themselves combing through Patterson Memorial Park where Rebecca often walked, checking every trail and clearing and hidden corner where a young woman might have gone for quiet reflection or where someone might have taken her against her will. They searched the old mill ruins by Willowbrook Creek where teenagers sometimes went to be alone, the covered bridge that was a popular spot for engagement photos and romantic walks, and even the town cemetery where Rebecca sometimes went to place flowers on her grandparents' graves and sit quietly among the weathered headstones, praying for guidance and strength. As night fell on June 10, 1989, casting long shadows across a town that should have been celebrating love and new beginnings, Rebecca Elizabeth Sinclair remained missing, and Willowbrook Springs found itself united in prayer and desperate searching for one of their own, a young woman whose absence left a hole in the community's heart that seemed to grow larger with each passing hour. The next morning brought devastating news that would haunt Willowbrook Springs for decades to come, news that would transform a mystery into a tragedy and hope into heartbreak. Sunday morning, June 11, 1989, dawned gray and drizzling, as if the heavens themselves were weeping for the missing bride whose wedding day had become a nightmare of unanswered questions and growing dread. The search for Rebecca Elizabeth Sinclair had continued through the night, with volunteers taking shifts in rotating teams and emergency lights illuminating the darkness as dozens of people refused to give up hope that somewhere in the woods or fields around Willowbrook Springs, a young woman was waiting to be found and brought home safely to the people who loved her. At 6:47 a.m., 12-year-old Timothy Daniel Foster was walking his golden retriever, Buddy, along the banks of Willowbrook Creek when the dog began barking frantically at something caught in the reeds near the old stone bridge that had spanned the water since before the Civil War. Timothy, the son of local hardware store owner Robert Eugene Foster, had been forbidden by his parents from joining the adult search parties that had been organized with military precision, but he couldn't resist taking Buddy out early to look for any clues that might help find Miss Sinclair, whom he remembered fondly as his third-grade Sunday school teacher who always had time to listen to his questions about God and faith and why bad things sometimes happen to good people. "What is it, boy?" Timothy called as Buddy splashed into the shallow water, his tail wagging in the urgent way that meant he had found something significant, something that demanded human attention immediately. Timothy followed his dog into the creek, the cold water soaking through his sneakers and chilling his feet as he reached toward what appeared to be fabric caught on a fallen branch that had been submerged in the recent spring rains. What Timothy pulled from the water sent him running back toward town as fast as his 12-year-old legs could carry him, his heart pounding and his breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with physical exertion. In his trembling hands were 2 ivory silk shoes, delicate pumps with small pearl buttons and low heels, elegant but practical, the exact shoes that Rebecca Sinclair had chosen to wear on her wedding day after weeks of careful shopping in Nashville with her mother and aunt. By 7:15 a.m., Sheriff Hutchinson was standing knee-deep in Willowbrook Creek with Deputy Marcus Jonathan Steinberg and the volunteer fire department's water rescue team, their boots stirring up mud and their voices hushed with the gravity of what they were confronting. The shoes had been carefully bagged as evidence, but they represented both a breakthrough and a heartbreaking development in the case that had consumed the entire town's attention for the past 24 hours. "These are definitely Rebecca's wedding shoes," confirmed Eleanor Sinclair, who had been summoned to identify them despite her family's protests that she shouldn't have to endure such an ordeal when her emotional state was already fragile beyond description. Her voice shook as she held the evidence bag containing the shoes that should have carried her daughter down the aisle toward happiness and instead had been found floating in the creek like discarded dreams. I was with her when she bought them at Patterson's department store in Franklin 3 months ago. She was so particular about finding the perfect height, not too high to be uncomfortable during the ceremony and reception, but elegant enough to complement her dress and make her feel beautiful on the most important day of her life. Dr. Sinclair stood beside his wife, one arm around her shoulders as she wept openly for the first time since Rebecca's disappearance, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of evidence that suggested their worst fears might be coming true. The discovery of the shoes in the creek suggested something terrible had happened to their daughter, but it also raised more questions than it answered, questions that seemed to multiply with each passing moment. How had the shoes ended up in the water when Rebecca was a strong swimmer who had grown up playing in this very creek during the long summers of her childhood? Where was Rebecca herself? And most troubling of all, had she gone into the creek willingly in some moment of overwhelming panic or despair, or had she been taken there against her will by someone who meant her harm? "We need to search this entire waterway," Sheriff Hutchinson announced to the assembled rescue teams, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years in law enforcement but also the strain of a man who was beginning to suspect they were dealing with something far worse than a missing person case. From the bridge downstream for at least 2 miles, and upstream to the mill ruins and beyond. If Rebecca went into this water, we need to find her. And if someone else put her in this water, we need to find evidence of that too. The search of Willowbrook Creek became the most extensive water rescue operation in the county's history, drawing resources and volunteers from across Middle Tennessee. Divers from the state police arrived by noon, along with specialized equipment for underwater searching that most of the local volunteers had never seen before. Volunteer boats appeared from neighboring towns, their operators offering their time and expertise in the desperate hope that they might be the ones to find Rebecca alive but injured, clinging to life somewhere downstream where the current might have carried her. By afternoon, the creek was filled with people desperately hoping to find Rebecca alive but fearing the worst with each passing hour that yielded no results. The methodical search pattern moved slowly downstream, with divers checking every possible hiding place where a body might have become trapped or concealed, while volunteers on the banks examined every inch of shoreline for any additional evidence that might explain what had happened to the missing bride. Reverend Matthews arrived at the creek around 2 p.m., having spent the morning leading prayers at the church and trying to provide comfort to both families while struggling with his own fears about what might have happened to the young woman he had watched grow from a shy child into a confident adult. The sight of the wedding shoes, now sealed in evidence bags at the sheriff's department, had shaken the entire community's faith in what should have been a day of celebration and joy. "Lord," Reverend Matthews prayed silently as he watched the searchers work, their faces grim with determination and growing dread, "if Rebecca is with you now, grant her peace and grant her family the strength to endure this unimaginable loss. If she is still with us somewhere, guide us to her quickly. And give us all the wisdom to understand what has happened here, and the faith to trust in your perfect plan even when we cannot see the purpose in such suffering." Michael Christopher Hawthorne had not slept since Rebecca's disappearance, and exhaustion was written across his face in dark circles and hollow cheeks that made him look years older than his 26 years. He stood on the creek bank still wearing his wedding shirt, now wrinkled and stained with mud from his own desperate searching through the night, his formal clothes a stark reminder of the celebration that should have been taking place instead of this nightmare of uncertainty and fear. His groomsmen, Thomas Quinton, Christopher Allen Blackwood, and Rebecca's cousin Jonathan Edward Sinclair, took turns staying with him, afraid of what he might do in his grief and desperation, afraid that he might blame himself for not protecting the woman he loved or that he might do something reckless in his determination to find her at any cost. "She's not dead," Michael repeated over and over, as if saying it enough times would make it true, as if his faith and determination alone could bring Rebecca home safely. "Rebecca is a strong swimmer. She grew up swimming in this creek every summer since she was old enough to walk. Even if she fell in accidentally, she would have been able to get out. Someone took her. Someone hurt her and threw her shoes in the water to make us think she drowned, to throw us off the trail of what really happened." Dr. Sinclair, drawing on his medical knowledge and natural analytical nature that had served him well through decades of diagnostic work, found himself agreeing with Michael's assessment even as his heart wanted to reject the implications. The shoes were caught in reeds near the bank, he told Sheriff Hutchinson during a private conference away from the crowd of volunteers and family members. If Rebecca had drowned while wearing them, the shoes would likely have come off and sunk or been carried downstream by the current. The fact that they were together, caught so close to the shore, suggests they were placed there deliberately by someone who wanted them to be found. Sheriff Hutchinson nodded grimly, his years of experience telling him that Dr. Sinclair's medical training was leading him toward the same conclusion that law enforcement instinct suggested. "We're treating this as both a potential drowning and a potential abduction," he said, his voice low and serious. "The state investigators will be here tomorrow to assist with the case. In the meantime, we're interviewing everyone who had contact with Rebecca in the days leading up to the wedding, looking for anyone who might have had reason to wish her harm or who might have developed an unhealthy obsession with her." The interviews that followed painted a picture of a young woman who had been blissfully happy and eagerly anticipating her wedding day with the excitement of someone who had found her perfect match and was ready to begin the next chapter of her life. Rebecca's co-workers at Willowbrook Springs Elementary School, where she taught second grade with the patience and creativity that made her beloved by students and parents alike, described her as practically glowing with joy in the weeks before the ceremony. Her students had made her cards wishing her happiness, construction paper creations decorated with crayon flowers and stick figure drawings of brides and grooms that she had treasured like priceless works of art. She had spent her last day of work before the wedding excitedly showing off her engagement ring and talking about the honeymoon she and Michael had planned to the Great Smoky Mountains, where they intended to spend a week hiking mountain trails and dreaming about their future together. "Rebecca was the happiest I'd ever seen her," said Margaret Louise Henderson, the school principal who had been Rebecca's mentor since she started teaching 3 years earlier and who had watched her develop from a nervous new graduate into a confident educator who could inspire even the most reluctant learners. She had found her calling in education, she was marrying the love of her life, and she was looking forward to starting a family and raising children who would grow up with the same values of faith and service that had shaped her own character. There was absolutely nothing in her demeanor that suggested any doubts or fears about the wedding or her future with Michael. The investigation also revealed that Rebecca had made several stops around town on Friday, June 9th, the day before her scheduled wedding, visiting places and people that were important to her as she made final preparations for the most significant day of her life. She had visited Patterson Memorial Park to leave flowers on her grandparents' graves, a tradition she maintained every month without fail, rain or shine, as a way of honoring the people who had helped raise her and shape her faith. She had stopped by the church to check on the decorations one final time and confirm last-minute details with Reverend Matthews, spending nearly an hour in quiet conversation about marriage and faith and the sacred nature of the vows she and Michael would be taking. She had even visited the local flower shop to thank Mrs. Hazel Marie Ashford personally for the beautiful arrangements that would transform the sanctuary into the garden of dreams that Rebecca had envisioned since childhood. She was absolutely radiant, Mrs. Ashford told investigators, her eyes filling with tears as she remembered the young woman who had been like a daughter to her since Rebecca was small enough to barely see over the flower shop counter. Rebecca said she felt so blessed and couldn't wait to become Mrs. Hawthorne. She mentioned that she planned to spend Saturday morning in prayer and reflection before getting ready for the ceremony. She said she wanted to start her wedding day with gratitude to God for bringing her and Michael together, and for all the blessings that had led them to this moment. But it was Rebecca's final stop on Friday that would prove most significant to the investigation, a visit that would open up entirely new and troubling possibilities about what might have happened to the missing bride. Around 4:30 p.m., she had visited Willowbrook Creek Community Bank to complete some last-minute financial arrangements related to the joint account she and Michael had opened for their marriage, a practical step that responsible couples took to simplify their finances and begin their new life together with clear financial planning. Bank manager Harrison Theodore Wellington III remembered the visit clearly because Rebecca had seemed slightly uncomfortable during her transaction, displaying an uncharacteristic nervousness that was completely different from her usual cheerful demeanor when she conducted business at the bank. Miss Sinclair was usually very cheerful when she came into the bank, Wellington told Sheriff Hutchinson during his interview, his own nervousness evident in the way he adjusted his tie and avoided direct eye contact. She always had a smile and a kind word for everyone, from the tellers to the security guard. But on Friday afternoon, she seemed distracted, even a little nervous. She kept looking over her shoulder toward the windows, and she asked me if there was a private office where we could complete her paperwork. When I asked if everything was all right, she said she was probably just being silly, but she felt like someone had been following her around town, watching her movements. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation like lightning splitting the sky, opening up possibilities that no one had considered before. The possibility that Rebecca had been stalked by someone in the days before her disappearance, that her vanishing was not random but the result of careful planning by someone with malicious intent, opened up entirely new avenues of inquiry that would require investigators to examine every aspect of Rebecca's life and relationships. Sheriff Hutchinson immediately began compiling a list of every person who might have had reason to harbor romantic feelings for Rebecca or resentment about her upcoming marriage, every individual who might have seen her happiness as something to be destroyed rather than celebrated. The list would include former boyfriends, rejected suitors, co-workers who might have developed inappropriate feelings, and anyone else who might have viewed Rebecca's engagement to Michael as a personal affront or loss. As Sunday evening approached and the water search continued to yield no results beyond the wedding shoes that had started this heartbreaking chapter of the investigation, the community of Willowbrook Springs gathered at First Presbyterian Church for a prayer vigil that filled the sanctuary with quiet sobs and desperate pleas to God for Rebecca's safe return. The sanctuary that should have echoed with wedding bells and joyful celebration instead filled with the sound of breaking hearts and voices raised in desperate prayer. Reverend Matthews stood before the congregation, his voice heavy with emotion as he led them in prayer for guidance and hope in the midst of circumstances that seemed to defy both reason and faith. Heavenly Father, we come before you tonight with hearts full of fear and hope, confusion and trust. We do not understand why Rebecca has been taken from us, but we trust that you know where she is and that your love surrounds her wherever she may be. We pray for her safety, for her swift return to those who love her, and for comfort for her family and her beloved Michael during this dark time when answers seem so far away. Eleanor Sinclair clutched her husband's hand as tears streamed down her face, her mother's heart breaking with each word of the prayer that acknowledged the possibility that her daughter might never come home. "Please, God," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of other prayers rising like incense around her, "bring our daughter home. She has so much life to live, so much love to give, so many children to teach and lives to touch. Don't let this be the end of her story. Don't let evil triumph over the goodness that Rebecca represents." But as the summer of 1989 progressed and weeks turned into months with no new developments in the case, the hope that had sustained Willowbrook Springs began to fade into resigned grief and unanswered questions that would echo through the decades like ghosts haunting the streets where Rebecca had walked and the church where she had worshipped and the school where she had taught with such passion and dedication. The summer of 1989 stretched endlessly for the families and friends of Rebecca Elizabeth Sinclair, each day bringing the cruel combination of hope and despair that comes with searching for someone who seems to have vanished from the earth without leaving so much as a footprint to mark her passing. As July melted into August without any new developments in the case that had consumed everyone's thoughts and prayers, the intensive daily searches that had mobilized the entire community gave way to weekend volunteer efforts organized by church groups and civic organizations, and eventually to the quiet, persistent hope that someone, somewhere, would eventually come forward with information about what had happened to the beloved teacher and bride-to-be whose absence left a hole in the community's heart that seemed to grow larger rather than smaller with each passing day. Michael Christopher Hawthorne found himself unable to return to his job at Willowbrook Springs Insurance Agency, where he had worked as an agent specializing in farm and property coverage for rural families who depended on his expertise to protect their livelihoods against the uncertainties of weather and accident and economic downturns. The routine conversations about policies and premiums and deductibles felt impossibly trivial when the woman he loved was missing and possibly dead, when every moment not spent searching for her felt like a betrayal of the promises he had made to love and protect her for the rest of their lives. His parents, concerned about his deteriorating mental state and the way he seemed to be disappearing into himself like a man drowning in grief, convinced him to take an extended leave of absence and seek counseling through their church's support network. The counseling sessions, held in Reverend Matthews' study surrounded by theological books and inspirational artwork, became a lifeline for Michael as he struggled to process emotions that seemed too large and complex for any human heart to contain. "I keep expecting her to walk through that door," Michael confided to Reverend Matthews during one of their weekly counseling sessions, his voice hollow with exhaustion and grief that had aged him years in just a few months. I hear her laugh in crowds, I see her hair color on strangers across parking lots, and for just a moment, my heart leaps with hope and joy. Then reality crashes back down like a physical weight, and I remember that she's gone, that the woman I planned to spend my life with has simply vanished like she never existed at all. Reverend Matthews, who had been providing pastoral care to grieving families for over 30 years and had thought himself prepared for any tragedy that might befall his congregation, found himself struggling to offer comfort in the face of such an incomprehensible tragedy. The theological training that had equipped him to counsel families through death and divorce and financial ruin seemed inadequate when confronted with the mystery of a young woman who had simply disappeared without explanation or closure. Michael, grief is not a straight path with clear markers and predictable stages, he said gently, leaning forward in his chair with the compassion of a man who genuinely cared about the young man whose life had been shattered by circumstances beyond anyone's control. There will be days when the pain feels unbearable, when you can't imagine drawing another breath without Rebecca beside you. And there will be days when you can almost imagine a future without her, when the memories bring more comfort than pain. Both types of days are part of the healing process, and both honor the love you shared with Rebecca. The investigation, led by Sheriff Hutchinson with assistance from state police detectives who brought resources and expertise that the small-town department lacked, had expanded far beyond the borders of Willowbrook Springs to encompass a multi-county effort that involved law enforcement agencies across Middle Tennessee. Every registered sex offender within a 100-mile radius was interviewed and asked to provide alibis for the morning of June 10, their background scrutinized for any connection to Rebecca or any pattern of behavior that might suggest involvement in her disappearance. Background checks were conducted on every man who had shown romantic interest in Rebecca during her high school and college years, every former boyfriend and rejected suitor and casual acquaintance who might have harbored resentment about her engagement to Michael. Even Michael himself had been questioned extensively in interviews that were both thorough and sensitive, though he was quickly cleared as a suspect due to dozens of witnesses who could account for his whereabouts during the critical time period when Rebecca vanished. Detective Maria Isabella Rodriguez, the state investigator assigned to the case, brought a fresh perspective and modern investigative techniques to the search for answers that had eluded local law enforcement. She was particularly intrigued by Rebecca's comment to bank manager Wellington about feeling followed on the day before her disappearance, recognizing it as potentially the most significant clue in a case that seemed frustratingly short on concrete evidence. "We need to map out Rebecca's exact movements on Friday, June 9, Detective Rodriguez told Sheriff Hutchinson during one of their strategy meetings in the conference room at the Sheriff's Department, spreading maps and timeline charts across the table like pieces of a puzzle that refused to come together. Every store she visited, every person she spoke with, every street she walked down, every moment we can account for. If someone was following her, stalking her movements and learning her patterns, there might be other witnesses who noticed the same person in multiple locations throughout the day." The painstaking reconstruction of Rebecca's final day revealed a troubling pattern that sent chills down the spines of everyone involved in the investigation. At Patterson Memorial Park, groundskeeper Albert Samuel Morrison, no relation to any other Morrisons in the area, remembered seeing a man in a dark blue sedan parked near the cemetery entrance while Rebecca was visiting her grandparents' graves, the car's occupant appearing to watch her movements from a distance that suggested surveillance rather than casual observation. At the flower shop, Mrs. Ashford recalled noticing a similar vehicle parked across the street during Rebecca's visit, the driver remaining in the car for the entire duration of her time in the shop before pulling away shortly after she left. Most significantly, bank security cameras had captured footage of what appeared to be the same sedan circling the block 3 times while Rebecca was inside completing her financial arrangements, the driver clearly timing his movements to monitor her activities. The license plate is partially obscured by mud or deliberate tampering, Detective Rodriguez explained as she reviewed the grainy security footage with the other investigators, pointing to the screen where the numbers and letters were frustratingly unclear. "But we can make out that it's a Tennessee plate, and the vehicle appears to be a mid-1980s sedan, possibly a Ford or Chevrolet based on the body style and proportions visible in the footage. Unfortunately, the investigation hit another dead end when they discovered that over 3,000 vehicles matching that general description were registered in the surrounding counties, making it virtually impossible to narrow down the search without additional identifying information. Without a clear view of the license plate or a witness who could identify the driver, the mysterious sedan remained just another tantalizing clue in a case that seemed designed to frustrate rather than illuminate. As 1989 turned into 1990, the daily rhythms of life in Willowbrook Springs slowly began to return to normal, though Rebecca's absence left a permanent hole in the community's heart that affected everything from church services to school events to casual conversations in the grocery store. The elementary school where she had taught established the Rebecca Elizabeth Sinclair Memorial Garden in the courtyard outside her former classroom, where her students planted flowers each spring and read poems about their beloved teacher whose influence on their young lives would last far longer than the brief time she had been with them. The church youth group, which Rebecca had helped lead with enthusiasm and creativity that made Bible study feel like adventure rather than obligation, dedicated their annual mission trip to her memory and raised funds for a scholarship in her name that would help other young women pursue careers in education. The scholarship, funded by donations from across the community, became a way for people to honor Rebecca's memory while helping ensure that her legacy of caring for children would continue through others who shared her passion for teaching. Dr. and Mrs. Sinclair struggled to find ways to keep their daughter's memory alive while also learning to live with the reality that they might never know what happened to her, that the questions that haunted their days and nights might never receive answers that would bring closure or peace. They converted Rebecca's childhood bedroom into a private memorial space, preserving her books and teaching materials and the wedding dress that would never be worn, creating a shrine to dreams that had been cut short by forces beyond anyone's understanding or control. Every year on June 10, they held a memorial service at the church, and every year, they hoped that this would be the year someone would finally come forward with answers, that some witness would emerge from the shadows with information that would solve the mystery of their daughter's disappearance. The services became community events that drew people from neighboring towns, all of them touched by the story of the bride who never made it to her wedding and the family that refused to give up hope for justice and closure. Michael eventually returned to work, though he moved to a different insurance agency in Franklin, 20 miles away, where he could start fresh without constant reminders of the life he had planned to build with Rebecca in the town where everyone knew their story and everyone carried their own burden of grief for what had been lost. He never married, though he dated occasionally at the urging of friends and family who worried that he was allowing his life to be defined entirely by a tragedy that he could not control or change. He kept Rebecca's engagement ring in a small wooden box on his dresser, taking it out on significant dates to remember the promises they had made and the dreams they had shared. He visited her memorial garden at the school every year on her birthday, bringing fresh flowers and sitting quietly among the plants that grew in her honor, talking to her as if she could hear him and sharing the details of his life that she would never know. "People ask me why I don't move away, start over somewhere else where nobody knows our story," Michael confided to Thomas Quinton during one of their regular fishing trips to a lake far from Willowbrook Creek, where they could talk openly without worrying about being overheard or causing more pain to the families who were still grieving. But this is where Rebecca lived, where she taught, where she made a difference in people's lives. Leaving would feel like abandoning her all over again, like saying that our love and our plans and our future together didn't matter enough to honor with my continued presence. The case remained technically open, with Sheriff Hutchinson and later his successor, Sheriff Amanda Gray Sullivan, reviewing the file periodically and following up on any new tips that came in through phone calls and letters from people who thought they might have information relevant to the investigation. Over the years, there were several false leads that raised hopes only to dash them again, reports of women matching Rebecca's description spotted in distant cities, claims from psychics who insisted they knew where her body was buried, and even a few cruel hoaxes from people seeking attention or trying to extort money from the grieving family. In 1995, 6 years after Rebecca's disappearance, the case received renewed attention when the television show, Unsolved Mysteries, featured her story in a segment about missing brides that touched the hearts of viewers across the country. The exposure brought in hundreds of tips from people who had seen the show and thought they might have relevant information, but after months of investigation that raised hopes and consumed countless hours of detective work, none of the leads proved to be credible or helpful in solving the mystery of what had happened to Rebecca. The show's producers included an interview with Michael, now 32 years old and showing the strain of 6 years of uncertainty and grief in the lines around his eyes and the premature gray in his hair. His voice was steady but his eyes reflected deep sadness as he talked about the woman he had planned to marry and the life they had dreamed of building together. "Rebecca was planning to spend our honeymoon at a cabin in the Smoky Mountains," he said during the filmed interview, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he struggled to maintain his composure. "She had packed her suitcase the week before the wedding, and she kept adding little things throughout the week, a book of poetry she wanted to read to me by firelight, wildflower seeds to plant around the cabin as a memorial to our honeymoon, even a bottle of champagne her parents had given us to celebrate our first night as husband and wife. She was so excited about starting our life together, about all the traditions we would create and the memories we would make. She would never have just walked away from all of that, never have abandoned the future we had planned together." The television exposure also brought forward one new witness whose information added another piece to the puzzle that investigators hoped would eventually form a complete picture of what had happened on that terrible morning in June 1989. A truck driver named Bobby Ray Jenkins, who had been traveling through Willowbrook Springs on the morning of June 10 during his regular route between Nashville and Knoxville, contacted police after seeing the show and remembering something unusual he had witnessed while stopping for coffee at the all-night diner on Highway 41. "I was getting back in my truck around 5:30 a.m. when I saw this dark sedan pull into the parking lot," Jenkins told investigators in a phone interview from his home in Kentucky, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had spent years observing details during long hours on the road. "A man got out and walked over to the pay phone by the highway. He was there for maybe 10 minutes, making a call or calls, and what stuck with me was that he kept looking around, like he was nervous about something or afraid of being seen. When he got back in his car, he drove off real fast, heading toward the creek area of town." Jenkins couldn't provide a detailed description of the man, as it had been dark and he had been focused on getting back on the road to make his delivery schedule on time. But the timing of the sighting, just hours before Rebecca's disappearance and in the same general area where her shoes would later be found, added another piece to the puzzle that investigators hoped would eventually lead to answers about what had happened to the missing bride. Dr. Sinclair, now approaching retirement from his medical practice after 4 decades of serving the health needs of Willowbrook Springs, had become something of an amateur investigator himself, corresponding with families of other missing persons and researching cold case solving techniques that might be applicable to Rebecca's disappearance. His study at home was filled with maps and timelines and copies of every police report related to Rebecca's case, creating a comprehensive archive of information that he reviewed obsessively in search of patterns or clues that professional investigators might have missed. "I know the statistics," he told his wife Eleanor during one of their late-night conversations about Rebecca that had become a ritual of shared grief and stubborn hope. "I know that the longer someone is missing, the less likely it becomes that they'll be found alive, and I know that cases like this often remain unsolved forever. But I also know that some cases are solved decades later, when someone's conscience finally gets the better of them or when new evidence comes to light through advances in technology or changes in circumstances. I refuse to give up hope that we'll learn the truth about what happened to our daughter, no matter how long it takes." Eleanor, who had aged visibly in the years since Rebecca's disappearance, her hair turning completely white and her face bearing the lines of accumulated sorrow, found solace in her faith and in the support of her church community. She had become a volunteer counselor for other families dealing with missing loved ones, using her own experience of loss and uncertainty to provide comfort and practical guidance to people who were walking the same dark path that she had been forced to travel. "Rebecca taught me that love doesn't end just because someone is physically gone," Eleanor would tell the families she counseled during support group meetings in the church fellowship hall. "She's still my daughter, and I'm still her mother. That relationship continues even though I can't hold her hand or hear her voice or watch her live the life she dreamed of. My faith tells me that someday, somehow, we'll be reunited in a place where there are no more questions and no more pain, and until then, I choose to honor her memory by helping others find strength in their darkest moments." As the 1990s drew to a close, Willowbrook Springs had grown and changed in many ways that reflected the broader transformation of rural Tennessee communities. New housing developments had been built on the outskirts of town to accommodate families moving out from Nashville in search of small-town life. The elementary school had been expanded and modernized to serve a growing student population, and Highway 41 had been widened to accommodate increased traffic from commuters and tourists heading to the state's recreational areas. But the mystery of Rebecca Elizabeth Sinclair's disappearance remained a constant in the community's collective memory, a reminder that some questions have no easy answers and some sorrows never fully heal no matter how much time passes. Her story had become part of the town's identity, shared with newcomers as a cautionary tale about the fragility of happiness and the importance of cherishing the people we love while we have them. The turn of the millennium brought with it advances in forensic science and investigative techniques that gave new hope to families with cold cases that had seemed impossible to solve using the technology and methods available in earlier decades. DNA testing, computer databases that could cross-reference information across multiple jurisdictions, and improved communication between law enforcement agencies offered possibilities that hadn't existed in 1989 when Rebecca first disappeared. Detective Rodriguez, now a senior investigator with the state police and one of the leading experts on cold cases in Tennessee, made it a point to review Rebecca's case every few years, hoping that new technology might reveal clues that had been missed or that changing circumstances might bring forward witnesses who had been afraid to speak earlier. In 2003, 14 years after Rebecca's disappearance, the case took an unexpected turn when construction workers renovating the basement of an old warehouse on the outskirts of Willowbrook Springs made a disturbing discovery that would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted the community for more than a decade. The morning of September 15, 2003, began like any other autumn day in Willowbrook Springs, with maple leaves just beginning to turn golden and red in the crisp air that promised relief from the humid Tennessee summer that had lingered longer than usual. Construction foreman Daniel Patrick O'Connor was supervising the renovation of the old Patterson Textile Warehouse, a massive brick building that had sat empty for nearly a decade after the company moved its operations to Mexico as part of the industrial exodus that had affected so many small southern towns. The warehouse, built in the 1940s during the economic boom that followed World War II and located on the industrial side of town near the railroad tracks that still carried freight trains through the heart of Willowbrook Springs, was being converted into luxury loft apartments, a sign of the town's gradual transformation from a rural farming community to a bedroom community for Nashville commuters who wanted small-town life with big-city convenience. The renovation required extensive work on the building's foundation and basement level, which had suffered significant water damage over the years of neglect when broken pipes and leaking roofs had turned parts of the lower level into a swampy mess that bred mold and attracted rats and other unwanted inhabitants. At 9:47 a.m., construction worker Luis Miguel Hernandez was using a jackhammer to break up a section of concrete flooring in the basement when he hit something that didn't sound like stone or rebar, something that made a different kind of noise that immediately caught his attention and made him stop his work to investigate. Beneath the concrete, wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting that had protected it from decades of moisture and decay, buried in what appeared to be a hastily dug grave that had been carefully concealed, were human remains that would finally answer the questions that had haunted Willowbrook Springs for 14 years. Dios mío! Hernandez called out in his native Spanish, immediately shutting off his equipment and backing away from the disturbing discovery with the instinctive revulsion that comes from unexpectedly encountering death. O'Connor rushed over to see what had caused the commotion, and within minutes of peering into the hole that had been revealed by the jackhammer, the construction site was evacuated and police were on their way to what everyone immediately recognized as a potential crime scene. Sheriff Amanda Grace Sullivan, who had taken over from the retired Sheriff Hutchinson 5 years earlier and had inherited the cold case files that included Rebecca Sinclair's disappearance, arrived at the scene with the county coroner, Dr. Marcus Anthony Fitzgerald, and immediately recognized the potential significance of the discovery. Willowbrook Springs had seen very few violent crimes over the decades of its existence, and the deliberate burial of human remains in a place where they were clearly meant never to be found suggested a connection to one of the area's most famous unsolved cases. "We need to treat this with extreme care," Sheriff Sullivan told the assembled investigators, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood that they might be dealing with evidence that had been waiting 14 years to tell its story. "If these remains are connected to Rebecca Sinclair's disappearance, we're dealing with evidence that could finally provide answers to one of the most heartbreaking mysteries in our community's history." Every detail matters, every piece of evidence needs to be preserved and documented with absolute precision. The careful excavation and removal of the remains took 2 full days, with forensic anthropologist Dr. Catherine and Whitmore leading the process with the meticulous attention to detail that characterized her work on high-profile cases throughout the Southeast. Dr. Whitmore, a specialist in identifying human remains and determining causes of death from skeletal evidence, had worked on several cold cases that had been solved through advances in forensic science, and she approached this discovery with the professional excitement of someone who knew she might be about to solve a puzzle that had defeated investigators for over a decade. Based on the condition of the remains and the burial method, these bones have been here for at least 10 to 15 years, Dr. Whitmore explained to the investigators as she carefully examined each piece of evidence with the precision of a surgeon and the curiosity of a detective. The plastic sheeting helped preserve some soft tissue and fabric, which should give us excellent opportunities for identification through dental records, DNA analysis, and comparison with clothing descriptions from missing person reports. The preliminary examination revealed details that sent excitement through the investigative team like electricity through a conductor. The remains belonged to a young woman, approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall based on measurements of the long bones, with auburn hair still partially preserved due to the plastic wrapping that had protected it from the elements that would normally have destroyed such evidence decades ago. Even more significantly, remnants of an ivory-colored silk dress clung to the bones, a dress that matched exactly the description of Rebecca Elizabeth Sinclair's wedding gown that had been described in detail in missing person reports and newspaper articles. When Sheriff Sullivan called Dr. and Mrs. Sinclair with the news that remains had been found that might be connected to Rebecca's disappearance, the conversation was one of the most difficult of her career, requiring her to balance hope with caution, certainty with the need for scientific confirmation. After 14 years of hoping against hope that their daughter might somehow still be alive, living under a different name in a distant city with no memory of her past life, the Sinclairs now faced the probability that their worst fears were about to be confirmed through the cold evidence of forensic science. "We need dental records for positive identification," Sheriff Sullivan explained gently during her visit to the Sinclair home, sitting in the same living room where Rebecca had opened Christmas presents and practiced piano recitals and talked excitedly about her wedding plans. "Dr. Sinclair, as a physician, you understand the importance of following proper procedures and confirming identity through scientific methods rather than assumptions. But I want you both to know that the evidence strongly suggests we found Rebecca, and if that's confirmed, we'll finally be able to give you the answers you've been seeking for all these years." Eleanor Sinclair, now 68 years old and showing the accumulated stress of 14 years of uncertainty in her white hair and deeply lined face, sat quietly holding her husband's hand as they absorbed the news that would change their lives once again. "Will we finally learn what happened to her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, afraid to hope too much but unable to stop herself from imagining that they might finally understand why Rebecca had been taken from them. "We're going to do everything in our power to get you those answers," Sheriff Sullivan promised, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who understood the sacred responsibility of bringing closure to families who had suffered for so long without resolution. "The forensic examination will take several weeks, but we should be able to determine not only identity but also cause of death and potentially even who was responsible for what happened to Rebecca." The dental records, maintained by Dr. Jennifer Rose Pemberton, who had been Rebecca's dentist since childhood and who had kept meticulous records of every filling and cleaning and orthodontic adjustment, provided a definitive match within 48 hours of comparison. The woman whose remains had been hidden beneath the concrete floor of the Patterson textile warehouse was indeed Rebecca Elizabeth Sinclair, the bride who had vanished on what should have been the happiest day of her life. The discovery sent shockwaves through Willowbrook Springs that reverberated through every family and every conversation, particularly among the older residents who remembered the beautiful young teacher whose mysterious disappearance had haunted their community for over a decade. The elementary school where Rebecca had taught held a special assembly to inform current students about their school's connection to the case, explaining how their memorial garden honored a teacher who had been taken from them by violence but whose memory continued to inspire new generations of learners. The memorial garden that had been planted in her honor became a gathering place for people leaving flowers and messages of support for her family, transforming from a place of hope into a place of mourning and remembrance. Students who had never known Rebecca personally wrote letters to her family expressing their sorrow and sharing what they had learned about the teacher who had cared so much about children that her influence continued long after her voice had been silenced. Michael Christopher Hawthorne, now 40 years old and working as an insurance investigator in Nashville where he had built a new life while never forgetting the woman who had been his first and greatest love, received the call from Thomas Quinton while he was reviewing case files in his downtown office. The news that Rebecca's body had finally been found brought a complex mixture of grief, relief, and renewed determination to see justice served for the woman whose killer had walked free for 14 years. "After all these years, at least we know she's not suffering somewhere," Michael told Thomas as they met that evening for the first time in months, sitting in a quiet restaurant where they could talk without being overheard or interrupted. "But now I need to know who did this to her. Who killed the woman I loved and buried her like she was nothing more than garbage to be hidden away and forgotten. Someone has been living with this secret for 14 years, and it's time for the truth to finally come out." The forensic examination conducted by Dr. Whitmore and her team revealed disturbing details about Rebecca's final moments that painted a picture of violence and deliberate murder that shattered any remaining hope that her death might have been accidental. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck multiple times with a heavy object in an attack that showed clear intent to kill rather than merely injure. The positioning of the remains and the careful burial, complete with plastic wrapping and concrete covering, suggested that whoever killed Rebecca had planned her murder and disposal with the methodical precision of someone who understood the importance of hiding evidence and had taken steps to ensure that the body would never be found. This wasn't a crime of passion or a random attack by a stranger, Dr. Whitmore explained to the investigators during her official report presentation, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had examined hundreds of crime scenes and could read the story that bones and evidence told about the final moments of victims' lives. The killer took time to wrap the body, dig a grave, and cover it with concrete in a location where it was unlikely to ever be discovered. This level of planning and premeditation suggests either a very calculated murderer or someone who was familiar with the warehouse and knew it would be a safe hiding place for decades to come. The investigation into who had access to the Patterson textile warehouse in 1989 revealed a list of potential suspects that included several former employees, security guards who had worked the night shift, and local contractors who had done maintenance work on the building during the years when it was still an active manufacturing facility. Among those contractors was a name that made Sheriff Sullivan's blood run cold with recognition: Harrison Theodore Wellington III, the bank manager who had been one of the last people to see Rebecca alive and who had reported her nervous behavior about feeling followed. Further investigation into Wellington's background revealed a disturbing pattern of behavior that had gone unnoticed during the original investigation, partly because he had been viewed as a helpful witness rather than a potential suspect. In 1987, 2 years before Rebecca's disappearance, Wellington had been quietly transferred from a bank in Murfreesboro after complaints from female customers about inappropriate behavior, unwanted advances, and a tendency to use his position of authority to obtain personal information about attractive young women. In 1991, 2 years after Rebecca's murder, he had left Willowbrook Springs abruptly, claiming a job opportunity in Atlanta that required immediate relocation. The sudden departure had seemed unremarkable at the time, just another example of young professionals seeking better opportunities in larger cities, but in hindsight it appeared to be the flight of someone who feared that an investigation might eventually focus on him. Wellington had access to Rebecca's financial information through his work at the bank, knew her routines and schedule through their interactions, and would have been familiar with the warehouse through his work processing business loans for local companies. Detective Rodriguez, now leading the renewed investigation with the passion of someone who had never forgotten a case that had haunted her early career, explained to the district attorney. He also fits the timeline perfectly and had both the means and the opportunity to carry out this crime. But when investigators tried to locate Wellington for questioning, hoping to finally confront him with the evidence that connected him to Rebecca's murder, they discovered that he had died in a car accident in Georgia in 1997, taking any potential confession or additional evidence to his grave. The investigation shifted to finding additional evidence that could definitively link him to Rebecca's murder and provide the kind of closure that families deserved even when the perpetrator could no longer be brought to justice. The breakthrough came when investigators, working with bank records that had been stored in warehouse facilities for decades, discovered that Wellington had made several large cash deposits to his personal account in the weeks following Rebecca's disappearance, deposits that couldn't be accounted for by his regular salary or any documented source of legitimate income. More damning still, his employment records showed that he had called in sick on June 10, 1989, claiming a family emergency that required him to travel out of town, providing himself with an alibi while giving him the freedom to carry out his planned attack on Rebecca. He stalked Rebecca on June 9, learning her patterns and planning his attack, Detective Rodriguez theorized during a case review meeting that included law enforcement officers from multiple agencies. Then he killed her in the early morning hours of June 10, probably intercepting her during what he knew would be her morning walk, and then used his absence from work as an alibi while he disposed of her body in a location where he was confident it would never be found. The cash deposits suggest he may have robbed her as well, though we know she didn't typically carry large amounts of money. The investigation also revealed that Wellington had rented a storage unit on the outskirts of town in July 1989, just 1 month after Rebecca's murder, paying for a full year in advance with cash. When authorities obtained a warrant to search the unit, they found it had been cleaned out years earlier when Wellington left town, but forensic examination of the storage space revealed microscopic traces of ivory silk fabric consistent with Rebecca's wedding dress, as well as traces of concrete dust that matched the material used to cover her grave. On December 3, 2003, nearly 15 years after Rebecca Elizabeth Sinclair's disappearance on what should have been her wedding day, Sheriff Sullivan held a press conference to announce that the case had been solved. While the perpetrator was dead and could never be brought to trial, the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to Harrison Theodore Wellington III as Rebecca's killer, finally providing answers to questions that had haunted a community for more than a decade. We may never know exactly why Mr. Wellington chose to target Rebecca Sinclair, Sheriff Sullivan told the assembled media and community members, her voice carrying both the satisfaction of solving a long-standing mystery and the sorrow of knowing that justice had been delayed for far too long. But based on the evidence we've gathered, we believe he had developed an unhealthy obsession with her, used his position at the bank to learn about her personal life and routines, and when she rejected his advances, either explicitly or simply by planning to marry another man, he killed her in a fit of rage and jealousy that cost a beautiful young woman her life and a community one of its most beloved members. The announcement brought closure to a case that had haunted Willowbrook Springs for nearly 15 years, but it also opened fresh wounds for those who had loved Rebecca, forcing them to confront the reality that she had been murdered by someone she trusted, someone who had access to her personal information and used that access to stalk and kill her in a betrayal of the most basic human decency. Dr. and Mrs. Sinclair, now in their 70s and bearing the physical toll of decades of uncertainty and grief, found themselves grieving all over again as they absorbed the details of their daughter's final moments and the calculated nature of the crime that had taken her from them. But they also expressed gratitude that the truth had finally come to light and that Rebecca could receive the proper burial and memorial that she had been denied for so many years. Our daughter was a person of deep faith who believed that truth and justice would always prevail, even when it seemed like darkness had won, Dr. Sinclair said during a statement to the media, his voice strong despite his age and the emotional weight of the moment. Today, her faith has been vindicated. The man who took her life can never be prosecuted in a court of law, but he also can never hurt anyone else, and the truth about what happened to Rebecca is no longer hidden in darkness. The funeral service for Rebecca Elizabeth Sinclair was held on a cold December morning in 2003, 14.5 years after her planned wedding day, in the same church where she should have been married and where her family and friends had gathered so many times over the years to pray for her safe return. First Presbyterian Church was filled to capacity with people who had known and loved her, people who had searched for her, and people who had simply been touched by her story over the years and wanted to pay their respects to a life that had been cut short by senseless violence. Reverend Matthews, now 76 years old and preparing for retirement after 5 decades of ministry, delivered a eulogy that spoke to both the tragedy of Rebecca's death and the triumph of truth finally revealed after so many years of darkness and uncertainty. Rebecca was taken from us by evil, he said, his voice strong despite his age and the emotional weight of the moment. But evil did not have the final word in her story. Today, we lay her to rest not in mystery and questions, but in the knowledge that she was loved, that she mattered, and that even the darkest secrets cannot remain hidden forever when people refuse to give up seeking the truth and demanding justice. Michael Christopher Hawthorne, now 40 years old and bearing the lines of 14 years of grief and uncertainty in his face, stood at Rebecca's graveside as her casket was lowered into the ground next to her grandparents in the Patterson Memorial Park Cemetery. In his hand, he held the engagement ring he had planned to replace with a wedding band on June 10, 1989, the symbol of promises that had never been fulfilled and dreams that had been shattered by violence. "I love you, Rebecca," he whispered as he placed the ring on her casket, his voice carrying across the cemetery where autumn leaves fell like tears from the trees that had watched over so many burials and so much grief over the decades. "I always have, and I always will. Rest in peace, my darling. You're finally home, and the truth has finally set you free." As the community of Willowbrook Springs said goodbye to Rebecca Elizabeth Sinclair, they also found a measure of peace in the knowledge that justice, though delayed by 14 years, had finally arrived. The young woman who had dedicated her life to teaching children and serving her faith had, even in death, reminded them that truth has a way of emerging from the darkest places, and that love endures even when everything else seems lost. The memorial garden at Willowbrook Springs Elementary School was expanded in Rebecca's honor, and a new plaque was added with a quote from her favorite Bible verse, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." It served as a reminder to generations of students that even in the face of incomprehensible tragedy, hope and truth would always find a way to break through the shadows and illuminate the path toward justice and healing. And in the years that followed, when other families faced similar tragedies and losses, they would remember the story of Rebecca Elizabeth Sinclair, the bride who never made it to her wedding, but whose love and faith continued to shine long after her voice was silenced. Her story became a testament to the power of persistence in seeking truth, the importance of never giving up on justice, and the enduring nature of love that transcends even death itself. The case of Rebecca Elizabeth Sinclair was finally closed, but her legacy in the hearts and minds of those who knew her would continue forever, a bright light that no amount of darkness could ever extinguish, a reminder that truth will always triumph over evil, and that love is indeed stronger than death.